Okay, in this video we're going to have a look at the impact that high inflation, so inflation generally above 3%, is likely to have on consumers and producers' living standards. So what are the weaknesses of having really high rates of inflation? So some of the things, this first video we're going to look at how inflation leads to an erosion of purchasing power and how it can lead to the concept of bracket creep. And then throughout the other videos we'll look at the impact on international competitiveness, on our growth, on efficiency and resource allocation, why it leads to increased inequality, and the potential impact it has on interest rates and why that hurts citizens as well. So the first video, as I said, is all about why inflation leads to an erosion of purchasing power. And when you're talking about an erosion of purchasing power, you know, a 1 out of 2 type response would say that high inflation is bad because it leads to reduced real incomes, and that leads to people can afford less goods and services. But a better answer would be able to link in the impact that both bracket creep and the fact that inflation hurts low income earners and fixed income earners more than other people into their answer of why inflation is bad for our purchasing power. So first things first, when inflation occurs, people experience a reduction in their purchasing power. What that means is there's a decline in the real value of money. So if you earn $100 a week and then inflation occurs, you can buy less goods and services with that money. The real value of your money has decreased. So any income that you earn from wages, rent, interest, dividends, etc. has less purchasing power because things are expensive. Inflation of 5% means we can buy 5% less goods with the same amount of income. This idea of purchasing power is only a problem if we can't increase our wages in line with inflation. So if our wages go up at the same rate of inflation, it's not an issue. But inflation can be a particular problem for fixed wage earners, so those that get paid a set amount, and regardless of what inflation occurs, for pensioners, for low-skilled workers with less bargaining power. So take self-funded retirees or unemployed people, for example. When there's high rates of unemployment, these people suffer more so than highly skilled workers, because highly skilled workers can often bargain for higher wages. They have higher bargaining power. You take the example of a paramedic or an ambulance officer as opposed to someone that's unemployed. If they both bargain for a higher wage, the ambulance officer or the paramedic can bargain for a higher wage because if they don't give it to him or her, then they can strike and then they're likely to get their wage increase. Where someone that's unemployed or a pensioner finds that a lot more difficult because they've got no bargaining chips. They're not offering anything to the labour market. They can't strike from being unemployed. So they often find it harder to increase their wages in line with inflation. Often those in weak unions suffer from high inflation because they struggle to make it hard to increase their wages. Exporters because we become less internationally competitive. And also ordinary families. Often when inflation occurs, the RBA will increase interest rates, and that can lead to problems for ordinary families because they might not be able to have less discretionary income and be paying more off their mortgages. And it can also lead to more unemployment as we become less internationally competitive. So essentially what can happen is fixed income earners find it hard to increase their wage in line with inflation, and because their wages, which is the red one, goes up at a slower rate than blue or takes a while to catch up, they end up with less purchasing power. So when you're talking about the impact on purchasing power of inflation, talk about the fact that it's low-skilled workers and those on fixed incomes that find it the most difficult to increase their wages, and therefore they suffer from inflation. Even if you do increase your wages in line with inflation, so let's say inflation is at 8%, and let's say you increase your wage by 8% as well. Okay, so for example, actually we'll do 10% because I can't work out 8%. Let's say your inflation's at 10% and your wage increases by 10%. On the face of it, it looks like you're just as well off. You've got 10% more money from your job, but prices are 10% more expensive. So let's say your wage goes from $80,000 to $88,000, so a 10% increase. On the surface, you're no worse off. Prices are 10% higher and your wage is 10% higher as well. You've increased your nominal wage to try and match up with inflation. But unfortunately, this leads to bracket creep. Bracket creep is the concept where an increase in nominal wages, so your actual wage, to keep up with inflation, leads to citizens being pushed into higher tax brackets, which reduces their real disposable income. So they try and increase their nominal wage to impact with inflation. That pushes them into higher tax brackets, and that reduces their real disposable income. And here's an example of that on the next slide. Here it is. So if you go from earning, these are the tax brackets as of 2000 and Okay, so say inflation increases by 10%, and let's say that you go from earning $80,000 to $88,000. So when you are earning $80,000, you are paying $17,547 in tax, because that's how much tax you pay if you earn $80,000. These tax brackets are a little bit old, but it still illustrates the concept. Then suddenly you start earning $88,000. Your nominal wages increased by 10% because prices have increased by 10%. But essentially what happens is you're now in the higher tax bracket. You're now in this tax bracket as opposed to the past where you were in this tax bracket. So not only now you pay $17,547 in tax for your first $80,000 that you earn, but you also pay tax on an extra $8,000 at a rate of 37 cents per dollar, which as it works out, you end up paying $20,507 in tax instead of the old system where you would pay $17,547. So to sum up, what essentially means is your nominal income goes up by 10% because prices have gone up by 10%, but that causes you to get pushed into higher tax brackets because you go from this bracket here to this bracket here, and you end up paying more tax than you were in the past, which means your real disposable income, so your disposable income after adjusting for inflation, is actually less than what it was before inflation occurred, even though your wage has gone up in line with inflation. So one problem is that inflation can cause bracket creep, where people end up in higher tax brackets and paying more tax and therefore having less income. There are some people that benefit from inflation. Those in strong unions can often increase their wages by a faster rate than inflation. Others will invest in what we call speculative assets, which generally go up faster than inflation. That can include like gold, diamonds, and artwork and things like that. And often lenders who lend money at market or variable interest rates. So when you're lending at a variable interest rate, you can raise interest rates when inflation occurs and make more money out of people borrowing from you. Thanks for listening.